Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to this event with the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of our guests here and also all of our guests on the webcast. There's been a slight delay with the start of the event because of certain demonstrations taking part in Washington, D.C., which takes us, I imagine, very much to the issue of looking at the consequences of the Arab Spring. The title of today's event is After the Arab Spring, Challenges for Credible Elections. And my name's Richard Chambers, and I work for IFES in Lebanon. And today's presentation is with my colleagues from IFES and also a special guest, a journalist. The background to this event is that IFES is an NGO that supports citizens' rights to participate in democratic elections around the world. Our independent expertise has strengthened electoral processes in many countries. I think since 1987 we've worked in around about 135 countries, including 12 in the Arab region. What we focus on is strengthening electoral processes and the role of local organizations, local stakeholders in building sustainable democracy. Of course, what we have seen in the Arab region is an Arab Spring of revolutions, and it's been followed by an Arab Autumn of elections. It's essentially been a busy couple of months, what with elections taking place in Tunisia for the National Constituent Assembly, in Morocco for the parliament, and also the start of the protracted electoral process in Egypt also towards the end of last month. And there's more to come. We're going to have another Arab Spring of elections. Indeed, over the next 6 months in the region, there's going to be 6 countries that have elections taking place, what with elections probably going to happen in Kuwait, in Yemen in January and February. We'll be seeing activities in Algeria with legislative elections due there. Syria even has elections scheduled for February. Palestine has talked now about holding presidential parliamentary elections in May. And of course we've also got potential elections going to happen towards the end of the year in Libya and in Tunisia. So the aim of this session today is to look at what challenges were faced by those countries that had experienced the Arab Spring in the conduct of elections. And what's next for the democratic transition in those countries, and what have been the lessons learned from those elections themselves, both by the countries themselves, by the Arab stakeholders, but also by the international community. We've got 4 guest speakers, and I'll go through them in order of the way in which they will speak. First, it will be Nicolas Kaczorowski, who's our IFES country director in Tunisia, the former head of elections for the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. Nicolas joined IFES in August and was immediately sent to Tunisia to take control of the IFES activities there, in particular to support the Electoral Commission. After that will be Dr. Fida Nasrallah, who's our Deputy Chief of Party in Egypt. Fida is somebody with extensive experience in elections around the world, and prior to her Egypt posting was the Chief Technical Advisor for UNDP in Indonesia. Following Fida, we're going to step away slightly from the IFES perspective and look at perhaps a broader perspective with Joshua Hersh, who covers US foreign policy and State Department issues for the Huffington Post. He was in Egypt for the revolution and for the election, so all aspects there. I knew Joshua when he was also covering a lot of activities in Lebanon in 2009, 2010. And finally, we have another IFES colleague, Dr. Staffan Darnolf, who's the Senior Election Advisor for IFES and was recently on our assessment mission to Libya. So that's the background to our 4 speakers and the background to today's discussions. It's a lunchtime event, and we are expecting perhaps a few more guests to arrive through the demonstration, so apologies in advance for any disturbance at the back. I'll introduce then Nicolas to start with the discussions on Tunisia. Nicolas, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to this event to discuss the Arab Spring and the electoral challenges with us. almost 1 year after the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi in Sidi Bouzid, I think it is timely to reflect a little bit on where Tunisia stands on its way to democracy, the progress made, and what are the remaining challenges in terms of elections that needs to be overcome before the next election. As you know, on 23rd, Tunisians went to the poll to elect their members to the National Constituent Assembly. The election was hailed by all, I think, as the first democratically held elections in Tunisia for decades. The elections were deemed credible, with results widely accepted by all stakeholders, which I believe is an achievement in itself. National mobilization make it happen. Everyone mobilized for that day to make it a success. Determination, patience, and enthusiasm of stakeholders, I believe, was one of the keys of the success. However, evident technical shortcomings were observed by observers and others. Incomplete voters list, very long queue that I'm sure you all saw on TV. A lack of strategic planning led to very late decisions that also in turn led to very late training of poll workers, for instance, that translated into some technical issues on election day. But also a lack of result management, which again, this is a very sensitive part of the process, which in my view also lacked the planning required. There was also a lack of a comprehensive voter education campaign, especially with a new electoral system. The Tunisians were not used to using a single ballot, but they were used to use rather an envelope system, and marking the ballot was something new for them that required a very good information campaign, which unfortunately did not happen. However, as I said, this election was a success, and it has to be taken as such. I would like to speak a little bit about the current political and security challenges before moving on to the electoral ones. The situation right now, and it's not very known, is, I would characterize it by a tense, volatile and fragile situation. I believe that this is a key moment in terms of democratic transition in Tunisia. It's a period of risk, but also of opportunities. The inauguration of the Constituent Assembly on the 22nd November was a moment of unity. The pictures that we all saw of emotions, but also of pride, of being on the way to democracy. However, today, some tensions already appear in the coalition of the three parties. Last week, tension culminated in the discussions on the law on provisional organization of the public authorities. And there were some key points of disagreement in terms of the extent of the power of the president, a honorific president versus a president with key powers, the extent of the powers of the prime minister, the required majority to approve both the prime minister but also to vote for the vote of no confidence, but also the way in which the constitutional articles will be approved or disapproved. And lastly, whether there will be a popular referendum or not to approve the constitution. The security situation is fragile and tense. During the electoral period, there was a relative calm and stability. All social revendication and actions were actually called off for the time of the elections. There were no major security incidents except in Sidi Bouzid with the invalidation of a list. But this period, I think, is marking the end of the social truce. There's a multiplication of social actions, sit-ins, strikes, demonstrations, occupation of factories. There is a clear social, economic, and popular discontent growing in the country. And there is also a clear social and economic despair that translates into, for instance, some serious clashes in Gafsa, Kasserine, and other parts of Tunisia. But what are the immediate electoral challenges? I'd like to dwell a little bit more on this. First of all, the first challenge is how to keep the focus of the National Constituent Assembly on elections. They have many other responsibilities. They have many other tasks that they will have to hold concurrently and organize concurrently, one being working on elections, but of course, first and foremost, drafting a new constitution. How do we make sure that they keep the focus on elections so that we don't lose time in terms of preparing the next electoral event? The second challenge that I see is what I would call avoid a vacuum. As you may know, the Election Commission is a temporary commission. It is called to cease its activities once their final report, both financial, administrative, and programmatic, is being released. And this will happen probably by the end of this year. There's a need for continuity now. There's a need to consolidate what Tunisia has achieved so far. As an interim arrangement, the president of the commission will remain in office as a caretaker. And I hope that this will be used also to consolidate and strengthen the process. The extent to which the president will have the power to continue to work on elections is unclear. What will happen with this embryonic election administration that has been built throughout the months? This is all pending questions. The third challenge that I see is adopt a new EMB law, a new electoral management body law. What will be the successor commission to the current one? How will it be composed? How will it be established? Who will be formed that commission? There's a political consensus right now on creating a permanent body and a professional and independent commission. But we don't know the nuts and bolts of how this is going to happen. But beyond the how is when, and time is of essence. And some discuss in countries already elections for municipalities sometime mid-year. So time is very short. I'm not saying the elections will take place, but they may. The fourth priority, as I see it, is to establish a strong, professional, and competent election administration. As I said, there were evident technical shortcomings. They will need to be addressed before the next elections. And for that, the Tunisians need a strong election administration. Fifth, draft a new election law. And that's why it becomes very difficult, because will there be a popular referendum? No one knows at the moment. It will depend very much on how, or whether, rather, the Constituent Assembly will manage to approve with the two-thirds majority of the Constitution. If it fails twice, this may lead to a referendum. But we don't know now. So the Constituent Assembly will have right now to start working on a law on referendum without knowing whether this will be used. But if there are elections, municipal elections, they will need an election law. There is no election law. The one that was drafted was specifically for the Constituent Assembly. Finally, complete the voters list. I think this is also one of the main priorities for the coming months. In closing, I would argue that Tunisia is on the right track towards democracy, but challenges are multiple that, if not addressed, could undermine or weaken the democratic process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, for that very comprehensive and very punctual overview. We've allowed each speaker 8 minutes, and that was very close to 8 minutes. I should point out to those present that there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the four speakers, and indeed questions can also be put through on our Twitter, whatever you use to describe Twitter. I'm not very familiar with that. But it's on our website page as to where the hashtag, I believe it's called, can go. Revealing my ignorance of Twitter, I now am going to also ask Fida to lift the veil of my ignorance on how Egypt went as well. Fida, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for giving us this opportunity. The mic closer. Is this better? We've heard Nicolas, and in the course of my presentation, you will find that there are some similarities. There are also very many differences with the conduct of the elections in Egypt. The elections in Egypt are a long affair. If you haven't managed to catch up, you still have ample opportunity. We have elections from now until the middle of March. And then we have constituency elections, the constitutional referendum, then we have presidential elections. Depending on what the constitution looks like, we might have more elections. So this is, elections are here to come. This is election fever. In the first few months after the 25th of January revolution, the debate in Egypt really was around timelines and timetables. Do we have a presidential election before we have a parliamentary election? Do we have presidential and parliamentary elections before we have a new constitution? Do we have any elections at all before we have a level playing field amongst political parties, nascent political parties and political forces? The debate was for a long time around the timelines and timetables. Soon the debate changed into the military power, the military rule, the length of military rule in Egypt, and whether the military was trying to remain in power for a longer period of time than it had promised. So it was decided that a swift return to civilian power would be best, and therefore new timelines were introduced. So elections took place on the first in a very long series of elections took place on the 28th of November. There was an atmosphere of calm, even though 1 week preceding the election there was an atmosphere of real intense intensity in Egypt, and we were very afraid that the security situation would not be good enough to hold an election. But against expectations, the elections proceeded calmly, and in an atmosphere of happiness and joy. Voter turnout was relatively high, and the people were enthusiastic. Voting was extended from one day to another day, in the hope that they would accommodate the long queues, and in the hope that voter turnout would increase more, because as we know, one of the many things that makes a credible election is high voter turnout. There was a visible presence of military personnel and police in and around the polling stations, but not inside them. And nevertheless, their widespread presence was not intimidating, and they did not engage in any intimidating actions. They did not even stop a lot of political campaigning that was going on around the polling stations. Now, even though the operation went well, nevertheless, there were several challenges associated with this election, some of which resulted in hiccups. And the challenges involved the challenge of implementing such a very complex electoral system, which we do not have time to explain now, within a very short time frame. And challenge of holding elections over 3 phases, and I'll explain that a bit later, and the challenge of implementing laws without procedures. Implementing laws without procedures is like trying to bake a cake without a recipe. You know, you have a list of ingredients and then you go and start baking, and you can, if you don't have a recipe, you might end up with something delicious or something inedible. So this is why procedures are very important, because they allow you to have uniform elections, properly administered elections. Sadly, there were no procedures, so the ink was administered improperly, leading to accusations that it was not indelible, which was not necessarily true. Counting would have been much smoother had we had procedures, but we didn't. And the issuing of ballot papers would have been better had we had procedures, because some of them were not stamped, and in the absence of stamping them, they should have been signed, and they weren't signed. So a ballot without being signed and without being stamped could result in not being counted. So if there is one thing that we need to understand and we need to really work on to improve the future elections, is to make sure that we have procedures. We sometimes think that procedures are a very soft subject, such as training and such as voter education, but none of those are soft, and without those, the election will not be administered properly. Now, we also have an election that is staggered over 3 phases. This is because you need judicial supervision. What makes these elections unique is that they are administered and supervised by the judiciary. Why? Because the judiciary enjoys a lot of credit and credibility in Egypt. But there aren't enough judges to have Egypt have an election in one go. So we have staggered elections. Every 2 weeks we have an election. And we have a by-election, and we have runoffs. So each election takes a long time. So we have a Judges Without Borders event to make sure that this election is supervised by the judges. And we have an unfair campaigning period, because those political parties and those candidates that are running in the 3rd phase enjoy triple the amount of campaigning time. They enjoy the same amount of money, but triple the time. So you have to be wise as to how you use this money. And much more importantly than anything that I have mentioned is the fact that election results will be known in advance. They will trickle in, and once you trickle in election results, then you have a skewed vision of what the country is going to look like, of what the results are going to look like at a time when 50% of the voters have not voted. So these are the challenges of the immediate period. To try to overcome some of the challenges that we have faced. But there are challenges for the long-term period, many of which actually are similar to the ones that Nicolas has mentioned. I shall mention two only. The electoral framework needs to be standardized or reviewed. As we speak, the electoral framework is scattered amongst 5 or 6 laws. Some of the paragraphs and some of the laws are contradictory. So to harmonize them into one electoral code would make our life a bit easy. And for another, we really need to look at the nature and composition of the election management body in Egypt. At the moment, we have an ad hoc body composed of judges called the HEC, the High Election Commission, or the H. They changed their name into the Higher Judicial Election Commission. For the constitutional referendum, we have the SEC, the Constitutional Election Commission, and for the presidentials, we have a PEC, the Presidential Election Commission. All of these are ad hoc in order to retain institutional memory and ensure that we have an election management body that administers elections professionally. I think that would be something to look at. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fida. And as I mentioned, our next speaker will be taking a different perspective. Perhaps that is as a journalist who was present for the recent elections. If I may now ask Joshua to take part in the discussion.
Yes, thank you, Richard. Have I done this correctly? Is this the mic's okay? All right. Yeah, it's really nice to be here. I'm very honored to be among people who actually understand the election better than I was just telling Fida before this that I on the way to Egypt was reading. I'd looked at it, but I actually opened and tried to thoroughly read the IFES report on the Egyptian election and was like stricken with paralysis and fear about this election, which I just completely didn't understand at all. And I think no one really does, even to this point. But I suspect that I'm here to maybe say something controversial or impolitic, and I'll try to live up to that. But first, I thought I would say something that's quite the opposite and talk about sort of the experience of the first day of this election, because for me, I've covered an election before in the Arab world. I covered the 2009 Beirut election, which or Lebanese election, which was much more of a I don't know, standard operating procedure. I mean, the Lebanese are pretty jaded about their electoral process, but the system works pretty smoothly. I went to a Hezbollah neighborhood, a town in the Bekaa, and believe me, everything went according to plan there. So all the votes were counted in advance. So that was not, there weren't really serious, you may disagree that there were election flaws, but it seemed like it worked all right for them. But you know, this is the first time I've been to one that was a first election, and I have these sort of images in my head of the New York Times and someone holding up the thumb with purple ink, and it all seems like a little bit of a cliche, and I wondered if it would sort of feel that way when I was actually there, and I sort of doubly wondered that because the week leading up to it, as Fida alluded to, was an extremely violent period. There was an intense amount of clashes going on near Tahrir Square, not actually in it, but right near it, and that had distracted a lot of attention. I still was more afraid about the election itself than I was about the violence, just because I didn't understand it still. But you know, the night before the vote on Sunday night, a bunch of us foreign correspondents were sitting around at dinner, maybe drinking too much and trying to decide, you know, if we thought the next day was going to be a wonderful, beautiful, cliched almost, you know, election day, or if it would be total calamity and blood running through the streets. And we were split down the middle on it. I mean, some journalists who were far more experienced than me were just adamant it was going to be the most catastrophic day of elections ever. So I won't name them because they were wrong about that. But anyway, the next morning, my photographer and I, we in that sort of perverse way of journalists, tried to find the neighborhood we thought was most likely to erupt in violence. We picked Shubra, which is this community, and it's a working class community, a mixed community of Christians, some Christians, and also a pretty heavy Ikhwan, Muslim Brotherhood community there. woke up at like 6 in the morning, which is like 2 Egypt time, since people don't seem to get up until 10 or 11 in Egypt for the most part, and went down there and nothing. It was by 7 o'clock there was a line of people, single file line. I took a picture of this because I don't think anyone's ever been in the Middle East would believe me if I told you this, but like actually a single file line. The women's side there's men and women. The women's side, maybe you can explain. The women's side was not single file. Women in the Arab world seemed totally uninterested in waiting in a line, but the men were lined up. Even when a herd of goats came by, no one seemed to get out of line, and things pretty much, they drank coffee, and you'd see this old man. I actually was there too early for my translator even, so I speak a little bit of Arabic, but not nearly enough to do interviews. And there was a man there shaking his fist. He looked at me, he said freedom, and he shook his fist so hard like his whole body was like shaking. There was that, and I started dawning on me that this is going to be one of those days. This is going to be one of those days where people really sort of experience democracy in that sort of potent, tangible way. At one point, the elections were delayed. The opening of this station were delayed by about an hour and a half, and that made us a little worried. But at some point, a guy came out who had been in. He'd gone inside to check it out and came out, and he said, and this I did get translated. He said, they're trying to make us mad and they're trying to make us leave by delaying it, and we were not. We were going to show them. We were going to stay here and we were going to vote. And everyone sort of did a big huzzah kind of thing. And it was actually really nice to see. It was really moving, and I think that's an important context for thinking about the Egyptian elections. I think that's something that you don't want to forget as you dive into the nuanced nitty-gritty of things that went wrong. And some of them were more, there were things that we were worried about. I wrote a story the day before from some of the election observers, more mundane things like they had decided to hold it over 2 days at the last minute, and there were a lot of concern about how they would store the ballots overnight. And one of the reasons for delay that morning was that the judges weren't satisfied with the storage facilities at this particular school. So they were delaying the vote, not because they were trying to cause trouble, because they were trying to make sure that procedures were going to be whatever, they were making them up on the fly, but that they were going to work okay. In the end, they were very concerned about windows, and in the end they had wax that they used to seal the ballot boxes, which is not, I understand, the preferred method. But this really struck me. At night, they sealed every window in every schoolroom where they had done this. They sealed the windows with wax, and they took it very seriously. And I was really impressed by that. Other things sort of over the course of the day that were interesting, and this is maybe going to lead to my next point, is that a lot of people were voting just because they were desperate to vote. They didn't really have a good idea of who they were voting for or why. There were these very colorful, maybe you saw on the Daily Show, they did a feature on this, these very colorful kind of hieroglyphs that each, because a lot of people, it's to deal with people who can't read, they have candidates and parties were assigned a toothbrush and a basketball and a baseball and just things that there was a missile, someone was a missile, a tank. And I heard from a friend of mine who was with the Wall Street Journal that he was watching voting, and some woman came and she looked and she goes, "No, not the tank. We have too much violence. Orange is nice. I like the orange." So there's probably a fair amount of that. There's certainly a fair amount of people taking whatever card was given to them and saying, "Oh, this is good." But the next point that I would like to make that I think is important, and this is for anyone who's having a heart attack about the results of this election, are that this election doesn't really mean that much. It doesn't mean that much both because the parliament has very limited powers. That's right now. The military has retained a lot of the power. It doesn't mean that much because it's a reflection more than anything of people's desire to vote without necessarily information. It's identity politics, people voting for things they're familiar with, not parties whose platforms they understand on any sort of sophisticated level. And it doesn't mean anything in a more subtle way because a lot of the activists in that week with the clashes sort of pulled out of the election and said this election, instead of being the culmination of a democratic process that started in February, we see this election as legitimizing a very undemocratic system where the army retains power. And we can go into that more if any. I mean, I'm happy to talk about this more at length. But I think that in a way, the successful execution of the election lends credence to that idea on some level because it's the army that made that election work smoothly, and on some level they were the ones who decided this election should happen. And so you could see why that case is made that this election was an election, but maybe not emblematic of a democratic process necessarily. So.
Many thanks, Josh. And thanks very much for that. And now, looking ahead to where elections are taking place, perhaps by the end of next year, is in Libya. And IFES has recently sent an assessment mission to Libya, and a member of that team was Dr. Staffan Darnolf, who can now perhaps give us some overview, very preliminary overview as to perhaps some of the lessons learned of Egypt and Tunisia, but also some of the other issues in Libya. Staffan.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you for having me here. And it's talking about Libya. It's like talking about the new kid on the election block here compared to Egypt, Tunis, and in Beirut has an extensive and long and distinguished, to a certain extent, experience when it comes to holding these semi-democratic elections. So there are basically two areas I will touch upon. One is sort of the mood in Libya and the sense when it comes to the transitional process as it's unfolding now, and then secondly also raising some concerns when it comes to this very ambitious timeline when it comes to elections that the Libyan authorities are facing. First of all, it was very clear to us that the Libyans are looking forward, they're not looking back. They are, like we've seen in other parts of the region, really thirsting for justice, for a democratic society. And the transition is very much for the Libyans, by the Libyans. Having said that, they are immensely grateful to the international support that they received during this revolution, but they firmly want to be in the driving seat themselves. And I think that's something that the international community needs to take to heart when they are trying to support the ongoing process. So a bit about the upcoming elections then. It will be extremely difficult for the Libyan authorities to pull off credible elections within the timeline. It's less than 6 months to go before they're supposed to have their elections, and so far not a single election-related decision has been taken. Yes, there's some ongoing discussions about an electoral law, there's some discussions about the electoral system to be used, but they're still discussing, so should we allow political parties to compete in these elections, or should it just be independent candidates to take part in these elections? And without these kind of decisions, it's almost impossible for any election authority to move forward with some real, genuine, on-the-ground planning and preparations for elections. So that brings me to the second issue of concern to me, and that's actually who's going to organize these elections. Yes, the National Transitional Council has appointed an 8-member strong committee to look into the issues such as the election law, as well as the composition of the Electoral Commission. But the clock is ticking, and they're still thinking about who's going to run these elections. And as I said, less than 7 months to go. We don't have a law. I mean, in Egypt, they were complaining about there are not procedures. We don't even have a law. We don't even have a commission. And once you appointed 8 members or 10 members, or however big the commission will be, you need to have a field structure that can actually implement elections, to start recruiting and identifying 30,000, 40,000 people that will be trained. And there's a massive job ahead of people when it comes to educating civil society, voters, about what is elections, what is the transitional process all about, and what is the constitution that we're going to be drafting. I would say that in general, the biggest problem right now with the transitional process is that you're facing an immensely condensed and compressed timeline that requires a fairly intrusive executive at the same time as you need to be inclusive to bring the stakeholders along with you. And to date, the NTC has largely been silent in reaching out to external stakeholders. It was rational, perfectly fine during the fighting that the NTC was hiding because of their own security. But now the fighting has ceased. They need to engage with the political parties, with the civil society, and bring them along. Because if they don't bring them along, a lot of the goodwill that was created during the fighting could quickly evaporate. And instead of having Libyan looking forward, they will start looking at the differences amongst themselves, and that could be a detriment to the process and undermine a lot of the decisions, urgent decisions that needs to be taken by the National Transitional Council. So I think I just stop there because I know there's a lot of people that want to ask a lot of questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Staffan. It will now be opening to questions. I think it's very clear that there are a number of common themes, in particular the two issues of trying to balance the enthusiasm and the goodwill that Staffan saw in Libya, and clearly through turnout we saw in Tunisia and in Egypt, and very much from what Joshua was describing as his observations on election day, with the complexities of defining timelines, putting everything together within the restricted timeframes that the opportunity has given. So we're going to have restricted time frame ourselves, and we'll be finishing in around about 30 minutes or so. So I'd like to call upon people to ask questions. If you can introduce yourselves and identify your organization if you're affiliated in that way. And I'll call them, and then I'll let you identify the speakers, or if necessary, I'll identify which speakers to go there. This gentleman first, then you, and then go like this.
Hi, Dan Blessington.
Could you just wait for the microphone, please?
Hi, I'm Dan Blessington with USAID, and formerly of IFES. I wanted to ask actually all of the panelists about the receptivity of the authorities to assistance being offered by the international community.
Thank you, Dan. So I'll start with Nicolas. How receptive?
Thank you, Dan, for this question. I think it's difficult to give a general answer to that because there are multiple actors in this election. Of course, from the government, although of course the government kept a very low profile, but played, in my view, an absolutely key role in the success of this election. And of course, the election administration. If I start with the election administration, since it was our main interlocutor, I think there was such a focus and emphasis on the independence. And we can say that the Election Commission in Tunisia was truly independent. They had a few other witnesses, but on that, they really managed in a very short period of time to create a truly independent commission. But the flip side of that was the fact that there was, at least initially, reluctance to engage with international actors, being us, IFES, in the field, but also with UNDP and with the EU. And there was also some disagreement within the Commission as to what should be the level of reliance on international support. On the side of the government, I think there was openness, but for the reason I explained, they were trying to take the back seat to help to give all the support required by the Commission to run a good process, but they were very much in the back. And of course, most of the technical assistance was rather going to the Election Commission.
Fida?
You know, there's always reluctance to receive assistance when you don't know when you're doing something for the first time. You don't really know what you don't know. So the situation in Egypt was a bit similar to the one in Tunisia, but IFES has managed with patience and with gaining trust to make some inroads. And even though perhaps at the beginning we encountered some difficulties, but as time goes on and as we were able to prove ourselves and to provide assistance with a very low-key approach, it became more and easier. Probably it will become easier as time goes by, but it is always a challenge to when you provide assistance in a country for the first time. There's suspicions that are not necessarily they're not necessarily backed by anything, but it's a normal process that we need to go through.
Joshua, Staffan, would you like to
Yeah,
add
no, good.
anything?
I get to be provocative now. This is good. I think that they made it impossible in Egypt. They tried very hard to make it very difficult for anything to work. I saw that with the observers who I got to know, none of whom would ever let me say that they were talking to me because they were petrified that any attention to them in the media would draw negative attention from and this is pretty much every organization there. And the Thursday before the election, the SCAF, which is the armed council, which runs the country, put out a communique, number 85, which said that empowered all civilians honorable civilians, I think was honorable citizens, I think was the term, to do citizen arrests of suspicious seeming foreigners, which all of us in the press corps assumed was directed at us, but I think actually was directed both at us and at foreign seeming monitors at the election booths. I mean, the only sort of upside I would say is that on the second day of the vote, I went to meet with a party figure from one of the new liberal parties, which had been around for about 3 months. And in terms of actually the process of running an election, I pretty much butchered everything through good intentions, but just having never done it before. It was just so hard. And they got, in terms of having volunteers at polling stations in Alexandria, this is where I was, the Muslim Brotherhood had 10,000 volunteers they had 40,000 in Cairo, they had 10,000 in Alexandria alone. The biggest well-funded liberal party, secular party, had 400, and this party, which was a sort of centrist and party with a lot of big-name candidates, had 12. They just didn't know what they were doing, and you could see in this meeting that this guy was and there was a international person there in that meeting also. This guy was sort of saying, we gotta listen to you more next time. Like we were scared to do it. It was hard to do, but they were coming around to realizing that they needed that assistance. So I think that they'll take it down the road.
When it comes to Libya, I can only say this is not Afghanistan. This is not Iraq. The Libyans are in the driving seat, as they should be. Having said that, I mean, as you know well, Dan, after doing this line of business for well over 15 years, you could have an MOU that's brilliant with the election commission that clearly details what you can and cannot do, but what it boils down to is personal relationships. And what talks in favor of Egypt is that we've been on the ground for a number of years. What's much more challenging is, of course, in the Tunisian context, just like it is in Libya, where you're basically being parachuted in and under an extremely tight timeline, work and deliver things at the same time as you need to establish that necessary trust and confidence in order to become effective. So I think that the June election will probably be, we will have less access on that one. But I think looking 10 months down the road, when we're having the next follow-up election based on a new constitution, I think then the potential access will be different.
Thank you very much, Staffan. There was a gentleman behind. Yes, you. This one. Yes.
Rick, I just wanted to know in Egypt about ranked choice voting and the right of recall. Can you comment on that a little bit? Are they using I know there's some runoff voting, but are they using mostly the single vote system? Is the typical Egyptian hearing about this? Are you guys commenting on it in the media, etc.?
Fida, do you have anything specific to answer that detailed question?
I'm not sure I understood the question correctly. Can you phrase it?
Yeah. I know there's some runoff voting, so that's
somewhat voting.
Runoff voting.
Yes.
So ranked choice voting is one way of describing that. I know the wiki page.
Ranked choice.
Ranked choice, where you can rank.
It's an alternative vote concept.
Okay. Let me explain to you just briefly what because the election system is quite complex. It's a parallel system whereby some of the choices are made. It's a majoritarian race where you choose 2 candidates from a list of candidates, And the other part is that you choose one political party from a list of political parties. Those political parties are closed. Those party lists are closed, and which means that you do not see the individuals that are on that list, at least not on the ballot paper. Those are shown on posters in the polling stations. So the voter needs to mark 3 ticks, 2 ticks in the one part of the race and 1 tick on the other portion of the race. The trick is that you have a minimum 50% representation of farmers and workers in both of these races. So this is why basically you have a lot of runoffs, because you have to get a 50% plus 1 in order to be able to win. And if you don't get this in the first round, you have to go to a second round. And if you don't get a farmer in the first round, you have to get to the second round. So this is why you have many of all the constituencies, only 4 actually did not go to runoffs. And all the rest went to runoffs, either because they didn't get the required percentages or because a farmer or non-farmer was not represented. When it comes to choosing people from the party lists, there is a ranking, yes. I believe this is probably what you're asking me. There is a ranking from the number of names on the list are equal to the number of seats in that district, and so you choose. If you get 1 seat, you choose the top ranking person. If you win 2 seats, you choose the first 2. You do not need to start with a farmer and worker in order to ensure a 50% representation, but you cannot have 2 non-farmers and 2 professionals consecutively. And there is, to make it even more complicated, how do you ensure a minimum 50% representation of farmers and workers in the list system? There is something called the electoral coefficient, meaning that, let's say meaning that you take the number of votes received by a political party divided by the number of seats won by that party, and the party that receives the lowest electoral coefficient is the party from whom the farmers and workers are chosen in order to make up for any shortfall. If you didn't understand anything, I don't blame you at all.
So literacy rate in Egypt?
Thank you, Fida, for a very clear. I want to know the Arabic for electoral coefficient. I know. This gentleman had a question. Then there was one. This gentleman with the blue shirt. Oh, well, in fact, somebody else has a microphone.
Just a question. Who the hell suggested this system to them?
We
And honestly speaking, talking about places where in the spring now, you are going to witness elections in societies which are not just in transition, but probably going to have election for the first time in their life. Why can't they opt for a simple election system? And why can't the international community just suggest them a proper system? Because as an election professional, I can tell you what you just tried to explain will not go in even to the best of the election professionals under the sun. Leave aside the common people on the street. So what is the international community doing about it? I mean, with so many elections now coming up everywhere, do you have any say in there?
I mean, the Egypt situation is unique, I think, in a way, because, and this is the cynical answer, because the revolution never really happened on some level. Because Mubarak fell, but the army that was always kind of in charge is still in charge, and they built the system however they wanted to do it. So this is the cynical answer. But you know, this was not a government creating an election system from scratch, or a new government or an international community. This was a regime intent on the status quo, creating a system that would confound. That's the cynical answer. I don't think anyone knows how they came up with it. I've been a long time there trying to figure out anyone had any idea how they came up with this, and no one seemed to have any idea. So.
Thank you. I believe Laura has some questions that are being submitted through Twitter.
Exactly. Yeah, we have a question from an online viewer. They would like to know whether you can address how Morocco's experience is unique, given that there was no regime change.
Morocco's experiences. Any of my colleagues wish to And just
No, Morocco.
well, IFES has limited program activity in Morocco, and we were not present for this election. There was minimum international election observation presence, but what happened in Morocco, just as what's happening in Jordan, is a very different way of responding to elements of the Arab Spring, including an attempt by both monarchies and their governments to perhaps undertake a consultative approach and draft a new election laws and so forth. I believe in Morocco it's a pretty low turnout in comparison to the elections that we've seen in Egypt and Tunisia, perhaps reflecting some aspects of the population's response. Yes, I think as moderator I just chose myself to answer the question in a very undemocratic way. But is there another question to ask? Then can I pass the microphone through to... The microphone's wandering itself, so I'm going to let that take the lead. But there's two gentlemen in this row and in the blue shirts. You can pick either one of the two gentlemen in the blue shirts.
Hi, Matthew Bank from the National Democratic Institute. My question's for Staffan about Libya. In your assessment, did you find that the NTC currently has the legitimacy necessary to create an election that the emerging parties and the population is going to buy into, or do you think that in the next 6 months, before they're supposed to hold elections in June, they'll be able to create that legitimacy?
I think definitely there's still enough time for the NTC to reach out to the stakeholders and start engaging nascent political parties, some of them a bit more established, but also civil society. I think it's a massive public outreach activity that needs to take place, not just from the NTC, but it needs to encompass more traditional leaders, tribal elders across the board. But they need to start ASAP, because that's my major concern, is that a lot of decisions are potentially upcoming being made in isolation without consultation, and then you having running the risk of there might be a fallout on such an approach.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm David, and I got another question about Egypt. I just wanted to build on something that Joshua said. I think he's absolutely right, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that over the past couple of months, we've started coming to the realization that what we thought was the main threat to democracy in Egypt, the Islamists, is probably less threatening than the SCAF remaining in power. And I just wanted to know if IFES was concerned about the role of the military going forward, and if you're confident that they will transfer power over to a civilian government as they promised.
You know, IFES is a technical organization. We deal with elections and the technicalities and not with the politics of the situation. So I would rather not answer this question and give you any comments. Thank you.
Joshua, I don't know if you want to say anything in addition.
I think that that's up in the air. I don't think it's definitely no that they'll turn over civilian power. I think I did talk to a couple sort of retired generals. There's always a few in Egypt who you can talk to, and SCAF itself is a very murky, obscure organization, and I think outside of higher echelons of the Pentagon, even below the top 2 or 3 well-known figures, what goes on in the next sort of tier of SCAF is very opaque, and it's not really clear. But my sense, and I don't know if this is creepy or a good thing, but my sense is that they actually do think that everything they're doing now is in the interests of the people and democracy. I think that they really think that they're doing that. I think that they don't understand the reaction that's creating among the intellectuals and revolutionaries in Tahrir Square, but they're calculating maybe correctly that those guys have less support from the general public than they did before. So I guess we're gonna have to see what happens in June. I mean, they very well may turn over. Some of the people I met, some of the liberal political figures, said that they think that SCAF is looking for a kind of soft exit now. They're looking for a way to step away from being the people at the press conference who get yelled at all the time because they don't like that very much, and just return to having a lot of money and power in a sort of quiet way. Whether they're allowed to do that or not, I think it's going to be really interesting. I don't think there's an obvious answer.
Are there further questions? To this gentleman? Thank you, John.
Hi, I'm Cole Bockenfeld with the Project on Middle East Democracy. I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things that was just said, specifically in regard to Libya, if you can comment, Staffan. We just heard that IFES is a technical organization, so I wanted to ask a very technical question. I mean, you kind of iterated that, you know, a lot of the electoral process and preparations are very much in a political stage with the transitional council. But also you mentioned that you're under very tight timelines, about 6-7 months now. From a technical standpoint, is it even possible for Libya for the authorities to get organized, for them to build the institutions, the processes, etc., to run reasonably good elections in 6 months, or you think that's technically going to be very difficult under current circumstances?
I mean, we as IFES as an institution has been advising and helping commissions around the world where we have had similar tight timelines. So it's definitely doable to make it happen. And then I do think that there is an enormous amount of goodwill right now in Libya in general. So I think that the expectations of these transitional elections are high, but also the tolerance level of what they could live with as acceptable is also there. It's a bit like we saw in Tunis. From a technical perspective, quite a significant amount of problems with those elections, but the groundswell was there. People were just happy they were actually able to be given the opportunity for the first time in a long time to have genuine multi-party elections. And I think that's going to be, to a certain extent, you know, the saving grace in Libya as well. But just reiterating what I said before, that requires that you start engaging people, start explaining to them what the process is going to look like and what's required from them to take part in the election. So we don't have a problem election day with a lot of people turning up and they didn't even know that it needed to be registered. Because in some of the discussions I held with even senior judges and prosecutors when we were talking about issue of gender and quota, and they told me, Staffan, what's a quota? So I mean, if that's the level where we are, that you know, one of the more sophisticated stratas of the society, you could just imagine further out from Tripoli, Benghazi, and so on. So once again, it's important that a civic and public outreach activity starts very, very quickly and is effective. I think that's one of the key lessons that I brought with me back from Tripoli.
And Nicolas, perhaps I can say a similar 6-month political commitment was given in Tunisia after the fall of Ben Ali, and then there was a delay.
Absolutely, and this created a lot of controversy at the time as to whether the election should be delayed. And of course, there was a division between the commission, the election commission, and I would say the political authorities. There was a fear of political instability if the elections were postponed. They were, thanks to the election commission that was really putting a lot of pressure on the government, trying to explain and give good arguments. And I must say we did play a role in that by trying to give technical argument as to why we believed that it wouldn't be possible to organize a credible elections on 24th of July. Political authorities decided to go along with that, and everything remained peaceful. And I think, without knowing Libya very well, and I won't tread into this territory, but at least in Tunisia, there were several elements that were in place. They had elections, as flawed as they were, but they had elections. So in terms of the structure, in terms of the governmental support that could be mobilized, I think this is something that existed and was very much drawn upon to make that elections on 23rd October a success. I am not sure that, Libya didn't run elections, and I think that's where probably there will be a huge difference. There was no real state structure that could be drawn upon, no voters list. At least in Tunisia, they were completely flawed, but it was a base to start with, which does not necessarily exist in Libya, as far as I know.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm Leila, a Tunisian. I'm a member of the Tunisian American Young Professionals Association. And what would you, I understand that you help government. My first question is, do you help civil society organizations? And are you allowed to? Because there might be conflict of interest. And another question would be, what would be your recommendation to civil society or any Tunisian, what can be done to make sure the next round is as successful or more successful, with a lot more observers from all the parties, not just the ones that are extremely organized? And what would be your recommendation?
Civil society organizations, played really a vital role, and they were extremely active. In terms of observation, I wouldn't recommend more observers. I mean, there could be more, but there were already plenty. I mean, the civil society organizations were extremely active in terms of fielding several thousands. I think there was 12,000 domestic observers, which is really a massive presence. However, the recommendation I will have on civil society and observation is to start doing long-term observation. Unfortunately, these 12,000 observers were only deployed for a few days around election day. And observation, as we know, is a much longer process, and they should be starting actually observing the next process already now, in terms, especially if there is a start of the voter registration drive again. So I would say long-term needs to be a focus. But where civil society can continue to play a role is really on civic education and public information in general. Not that Tunisians are not educated, but simply, as I said, we don't know the kind of political electoral system that would be chosen, but it would be different from the envelope system for sure, because now it's too loaded in political terms. So there will be a new system, probably different from the system that were used during the National Constituent Assembly election. Therefore, there will need to be efforts, again, to reach out to the voters and explain the role and responsibilities of the next president, if it is presidential elections, or the parliamentary election, or municipal election, who knows. I think the civil society has a role to play in lobbying the National Constituent Assembly when it comes to the electoral law, for instance, or participating in discussions on the kind of electoral management body Tunisia needs for the next election. So a very strong advocacy role, I would see, for the civil society. And finally, a topic that I feel is very close to my heart is the disabled and the illiterates. In Tunisia, there are at the moment 1.7 million illiterates, and this is a very little known fact. And I think there is a need for the civil society to really focus on some of these groups that have been marginalized in the last few decades, in fact, both on disability, disabled persons, and the illiterates. But again, just to finish on the civic education, I think it is absolutely crucial that on these very important matters, there is a closer link between the next electoral management body and the civil society. Because what we saw in the last elections, some of the messages that civil society organizations were carrying it towards to the voters were actually contradicting what the law said, or what the procedures said, or what the election commission had decided. And that's where you start spreading confusion instead of clarifying some of these very, very important issues.
Well, thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question. If this gentleman's asked a question already, is there someone else? Then I think there's just a question here.
Hi, Alexis Arieff with the Congressional Research Service. I wonder, Nicolas, if you could speak also about this current process that you alluded to of deciding the internal procedures of the Constituent Assembly in Tunisia. I think it was pretty clear to those of us who were following the pre-electoral period that not enough attention was being focused on deciding these procedures, which will be as important as anything else in determining what the Constitution looks like and how long it takes and whether it ever happens. Are any international organizations providing technical advice and assistance on the pros and cons of different types of procedures? For example, a 50% plus one deciding vote versus a 2/3 majority vote versus, overturning the government with a 3/4 versus, 50%. I mean, it seems like there's sort of a lack of understanding of the pros and cons of some of these different models.
Yeah. I think currently the Constituent Assembly is struggling with debating two issues. One, if the internal rules and procedures for the Assembly and organizing their own work in terms of commission, number of members, and the majority rules in those commissions. And on the other hand, which is actually important for the coming year, is how the public authorities will be actually organized until the next election. And that's where most of the debate and controversy are occurring at the moment. And as we speak, or maybe they went to bed now, but today was a very important day in Tunisia because they were trying to discuss this, the draft law on this issue in the plenary session. But I understand that they're moving very, very slowly. It's a long document. They call it now the mini constitution with 300 and some articles. And some parties were very willing to try to push it through very quickly because, of course, everyone is waiting. The president has not been appointed. The prime minister is still waiting to be appointed. And the country is moving very slowly. But yet the Constitutional Assembly said, no, we have to look at the articles. We have to debate some of these very important issues. And I mentioned some of them that are raising controversy. Being the president, this seems to be now solved. At least there's an agreement in the coalition and among opposition parties that the president will have a bit more power in the sense that before the prime minister could just propose something that the president and the president couldn't really say anything. Now the president will have to be consulted on some of the high-level officials' appointment and other issues. In terms of the majority for adopting the constitution, it seems that now there is also an agreement that is emerging, which is 2 readings of the same law with a 2/3 majority. If the 2/3 majority in the second attempt to vote, not second reading, second attempt to adopt it failed, then there will be a popular referendum. And this seems also to be all parties, most of the parties seems to be in agreement with that. So a lot of issues that are going to be absolutely key for the next few months in terms of also in electoral terms. That's why I wanted to mention those issues because they will have a great impact on the rest of the situation. There was a statement yesterday by one of the vice president of the assembly saying there will be a law on the electoral management body. We'll create a permanent professional electoral management body. This is all fine, but this is not the first thing they're going to work on. And now they're talking about having 22 sub-commissions, I think, which is really quite many. They love commissions in Tunisia. I think maybe you can vouch for that. And I hope that one will be on elections, but we don't know yet. And of course, in terms of our role would be really to try to work as much as we can with a sub-commission on elections to try to bring some comparative analysis, comparative experience, and so on and so forth, if there's an interest. I would say that the UNDP, in closing, I would say the UNDP has a massive technical assistance program in terms of the Constituent Assembly. So yes, there are many actors out there really trying to find entry points and to try to work with some of the members.
Many thanks, Nicolas. Many thanks indeed to all of my colleagues up here and many thanks to you. This place is as crowded as a Tunisian polling station, and it reflects the enthusiasm that is on this interest. The theme seems to me more work on frameworks and recognition of the tight timeframes to do that. Yeah. So there will continue to be a strong need for rapid planning for elections and rapid drafting of those laws, but also, as Staffan has alluded to, broad consultation with the stakeholders on that, and certainly civic education. Well, many thanks to all of you present for coming this lunchtime, and to all of those who are on the webcast, and I draw this to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you.